What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected legends sits down with a television host who thinks he can break anyone? In just 37 seconds, Piers Morgan would learn that some guests refused to play by his rules, and the explosion that followed would shake the very foundations of live television. The studio lights blazed hot that evening as Robert De Niro walked onto the set. The legendary actor, known for his intense performances in films like Taxi Driver and Goodfellas, carried himself with the quiet dignity that had made him an icon. His weathered face told stories of decades in the business, and his eyes held the kind of depth that comes from a lifetime of observing human nature. Across from him sat Piers Morgan, the British host, whose sharp tongue and aggressive interviewing style had made him both famous and infamous. Morgan leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk, the one that said he believed he could dismantle anyone who dared sit across from him. Tonight, he was confident he would add another notch to his belt. "Robert, welcome to the show," Morgan began, his voice carrying that practiced television charm that barely concealed something harder beneath. "You know, I have to say, you look a bit tired. Are you feeling all right?" It was a strange way to start an interview, and De Niro's eyebrows raised slightly. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied simply, his voice calm but carrying an edge of caution. Morgan pressed forward, seemingly oblivious to the warning signs. "Because you know, at your age, 79, some might say you should be slowing down. Maybe enjoying retirement instead of still trying to prove yourself." The words hung in the air like poison. De Niro's expression didn't change much, but something shifted in his posture. Those who knew him well would have recognized the subtle tightening around his eyes, the way his hands positioned themselves on the armrests of his chair. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone," De Niro said quietly. "I've been doing this for over 50 years. "Yes, but surely you must feel the pressure," Morgan continued, leaning forward like a predator, sensing weakness. "I mean, your recent films haven't exactly been box office gold, have they? Some critics are saying you're past your prime." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the respectful conversation they had expected to witness between two accomplished men. This felt more like an ambush, and De Niro was the target. "Which critics?" De Niro asked, his voice still controlled, but with steel beginning to show through. Morgan waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, you know, the usual suspects. The point is, Robert, don't you think it might be time to step aside and let the younger generation take over?" It was a question that might have rattled a lesser man, but De Niro had faced down characters far more intimidating than a television host with delusions of grandeur. He looked directly at Morgan, those famous eyes focusing with laser intensity. "Let me ask you something, Piers," De Niro said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that filled the room. "How long have you been doing this?" Morgan seemed pleased that De Niro was engaging. "Television? Oh, about 20 years now. And in those 20 years," De Niro continued, "how many times have you been fired?" The question landed like a physical blow. Morgan's confident expression faltered for just a moment before he tried to recover with a laugh that sounded forced and hollow. "Well, that's quite a personal question, isn't it?" Morgan stammered. "You made it personal when you questioned my relevance," De Niro replied evenly. "So I'll ask again, how many times?" The studio had gone dead quiet. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, unsure whether they should keep rolling or look away from what was becoming a public execution. Morgan's face was beginning to redden. "I don't see how that's relevant to our discussion about your career." "It's relevant because you're sitting here questioning whether I should retire while your own career has been a series of scandals and departures," De Niro said, his voice never rising but somehow becoming more commanding with each word. "You were removed from one network for ethical violations. You were let go from another for pushing boundaries that shouldn't be pushed. And now you're here, trying to make a name for yourself by tearing down people who have actually accomplished something." Morgan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. This wasn't going according to his script at all. Usually, by this point in an interview, he would have his guests flustered and defensive. Instead, he found himself being dissected by a master of human observation. "Now wait just a minute," Morgan finally managed to sputter. "You can't just come on my show and attack me personally." De Niro tilted his head slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to be both innocent and devastating. "Isn't that exactly what you've been doing to me since I sat down?" The logic was unassailable, and Morgan knew it. He could feel control of the situation slipping away from him like sand through his fingers. The audience was no longer on his side, if they ever had been. He could sense their sympathy shifting toward his guest, and desperation began to creep into his voice. Look, Robert, I'm just trying to have an honest conversation here, Morgan said, attempting to regain his footing. Surely you can understand that viewers want to know about the real you, not just some polished Hollywood image. The real me? De Niro repeated, and now there was something almost dangerous in his tone. You want to know about the real me? The real me has spent decades perfecting his craft, while you've spent your time perfecting the art of being a professional instigator. Morgan's face was now fully flushed, and sweat was beginning to form on his brow, despite the studio's air conditioning. I think you're being quite unfair, he protested weakly. Am I? De Niro asked. Because from where I'm sitting, you invited me here under the pretense of discussing my work, and instead you've spent the entire time trying to diminish me. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Morgan looked around desperately, as if hoping his production team might somehow save him from the hole he had dug for himself. But there was no rescue coming. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Morgan's eyes darted between De Niro and the cameras, his mind racing to find some way to salvage what was left of his reputation. But De Niro wasn't finished. The legendary actor leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow commanded more attention than any shout could have. You know what the difference is between us, Piers? De Niro asked, his tone conversational but loaded with meaning. When I create a character, I spend months studying human behavior, understanding motivations, finding truth in the role. You just play the same character every night. The bully who thinks controversy equals journalism. Morgan's jaw tightened. He knew he was losing badly, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. I'm not a bully, Robert. I'm a journalist, asking tough questions. Tough questions? De Niro repeated, and for the first time, there was a hint of amusement in his voice. You asked me if I felt tired. You suggested I should retire because of my age. You questioned my relevance without having done any research about my recent work. Those aren't tough questions. They're lazy attempts at provocation. The audience was completely captivated now. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. This was a masterclass in dignity under fire. And they were witnessing a legend defend not just himself, but the very concept of respectful discourse. Morgan tried one more desperate gambit. Well, perhaps we should talk about your political views then. I know you have some very strong opinions about certain public figures. It was meant to be a trap, an attempt to drag De Niro into controversial territory where Morgan could regain some advantage. But the actor saw right through it. Of course you want to change the subject, De Niro said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, because you know you can't win this conversation on merit alone. So now you want to create a different controversy to distract from the fact that you've completely embarrassed yourself. Morgan's face went from red to purple. I haven't embarrassed myself, he snapped, his professional composure finally cracking. You're the one being difficult here. Difficult? De Niro's eyebrows rose. I answered your questions. I've been polite. I've sat here while you've tried to insult me repeatedly. The only thing I've done is refuse to let you walk all over me, and apparently that makes me difficult. You're twisting my words, Morgan protested, but his voice was getting higher and more strained. I'm not twisting anything, De Niro replied calmly. I'm simply repeating what you said. Would you like me to quote you exactly? The threat hung in the air. Morgan knew that De Niro had the kind of memory that came from decades of memorizing scripts and studying human behavior. If he wanted to quote him word for word, he probably could. That won't be necessary, Morgan muttered. Good, De Niro said, settling back in his chair, because I think we've established what kind of interviewer you are. The insult was delivered so smoothly that it took a moment for its full impact to register. When it did, Morgan's face contorted with rage. How dare you come on my show and speak to me like that, he sputtered. Your show? De Niro asked, tilting his head again in that devastatingly innocent gesture. I thought this was supposed to be a conversation between equals, but I suppose that was my mistake. It was the final straw. Morgan shot to his feet, his chair rolling backward. I don't have to sit here and take this from you, he declared, his voice shaking with fury. De Niro remained seated, looking up at the standing host with an expression of mild curiosity. Take what exactly? Accountability for your behavior? You're being completely unreasonable. Morgan shouted, all pretense of professionalism abandoned. I invited you here to have a civilized discussion, and you've done nothing but attack me. I've answered every question you've asked, De Niro said, his voice remaining steady while Morgan's grew more agitated. The fact that my answers made you uncomfortable isn't my problem. Morgan looked around wildly, as if seeking support from his crew, but found only stunned faces staring back at him. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of his meltdown for posterity. "This interview is over," Morgan announced, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Security, please escort Mr. De Niro from the building." But De Niro was already standing, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who had made his point and had nothing left to prove. "That won't be necessary," he said, straightening his jacket. "I was planning to leave anyway." "You can't just walk out," Morgan called after him, his voice cracking with desperation. De Niro paused at the edge of the stage and turned back to face the cameras directly, ignoring Morgan entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the audience with the same quiet authority he had displayed throughout the entire encounter, "I came here tonight hoping to have an intelligent conversation about my work and my craft. Instead, I found myself dealing with someone who seems to believe that rudeness and disrespect are substitutes for actual journalism." Morgan tried to interrupt, but De Niro continued, his voice cutting through the host's protests like a knife through paper. "I've spent my entire career trying to bring truth and authenticity to my performances. I refuse to compromise those values just to satisfy someone's need for cheap television drama." With that, he walked off the stage, leaving behind a stunned audience and a host who had just experienced the most public and complete dismantling of his career. Morgan stood alone in the spotlight, his face a mask of humiliation and rage, while the cameras continued to roll and capture every moment of his defeat. The legendary actor had entered the studio that night as a guest. He left as something else entirely, a reminder that true dignity cannot be shaken by petty provocations, and that sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is simply refusing to play the game. Morgan had tried to break De Niro and instead had broken himself, live on television in front of millions of viewers who would never forget what they had witnessed.